Evening, folks at Hebe Haven Yacht Club and others that are joining us online. Welcome to tonight's webinar. I'm delivering this from Scotland, so this is the middle of the morning for me here. But we're going to run through a Mark Lane webinar. We have some people in the clubhouse at Hebe Haven that are listening in, and quite a few people sort of joining us online as we go through. We do have some breaks for questions that are built in. So if you've got some questions, if you can save them till then, we're going to run through a presentation. And I guess there is also a kind of chat function. So you know, if you've got a particular question and you want to send it in via the chat thing, then we can have a look at trying to answer that when we maybe get towards the end of the presentation. But other than that, if you do want to ask a question, just make sure you kind of unmute yourself. Otherwise, we're not going to hear what's happening. And it's probably good practice to kind of be muted. You know, if you're sitting at home, kind of listening in, and that way, if there's any sort of background noises, it's not going to interrupt what everyone's trying to listen to. So unmute, please, if you've got some questions, and if you can just save them for the question breaks that are built into the presentation. Okay. So moving on, then we'll share the screen with you, and we'll make a little start. Okay, so hopefully you can all see a sort of title slide there. That's great. Okay, so this is the second webinar that we've run for Mark Layers, which is one of the sort of race official roles. Just as a sort of recap, if you're at the previous one, which was a couple of weeks ago now, we're really looking at the sort of the individual personal skills of Mark Layers, in particular with the use of their sort of GPS. And we're talking about a handheld GPS here, so how to set up the GPS. Having the ability to be able to sort of save and name waypoints. And we introduced the reference point mark laying sheet, which was a big grid with thousands of numbers on it. So we introduced that to those at the previous webinar. And that sheet, the numbers on that sheet were really just the bearing to waypoint and the distance to waypoint function, the waypoint being gate 4 or a committee boat. And you need to measure the windward mark distance away from it. So a lot of the previous webinar was about individuals understanding that GPS theory. And then there was, for those that are at the club, there was a short practical session going out into the dinghy park to try and set up, use bearing and distance function to set up a trapezoid using cones or markers around the dinghy park. So this time we're moving on a little bit. We're looking at the event preparation, getting all the kit ready for an event, some of the personal mark laying equipment that you might think about needing or wanting to get, and the importance of looking at a mark laying system within the club. And then we'll talk a wee bit about of wind and tide theory, and actually how we agree an axis for setting a course up on. So it's not always just a windward mark. We use the term course axis rather than what's the wind direction, because there could be a bit of tide and there could be different wind as well. So that's the term axis that we're talking about there. That's what we'll look at this time. So I guess really the first thing just to be aware of it as a sort of race official is most events have a notice of race, and that will fix the dates and the venues for the race, and that has to come out well in advance so that sailors could, you know, particularly for international regattas and things like that, that they can book flights and make travel accommodation. So there is a sort of requirement, and that's a sort of minimum of 90 days in advance of an event. So that's in a sort of official documentation that's required. So 90 days or more, and quite often it is more, is that the date and the venue gets announced for an event. So even as if you're wanting to be involved with that event, you've got plenty of warning that it's coming in the same way that the sailors have. Then the sailing instructions come out. Now they come out much later, and for some of the sailors, they might only become available when they turn up at the event and registration, and then they're given the sailing instructions. Sometimes they appear a little bit earlier, and in club situations sometimes they're published for the year in a sort of club handbook, but they provide much more detailed information to the competitors. But there's information in the sailing instructions that's useful for us as mark layers to understand. So from the sailing instructions, there'll be lots of other information in there for sailors about the rules and changes to rules and amendments to this. But what happens is that you will get a description of the course marks within the sailing instructions. And that's quite important if you're involved with particularly with a big event, so not, rather than maybe just a club event, you know, and the race officer who's maybe visiting the club has written in that the race marks are going to be orange cylinders, and you're sitting there going, we don't have orange cylinders at our clubs, we've got yellow triangles, then right away there's a bit of an issue. So it's a good opportunity to ask to get involved with the writing of sailing instructions so that you can make sure that the equipment that your club has is actually available, and that the sailing instructions aren't being done unconnected, if you like, to what you've got. So the description of course marks will be in the sailing instructions. So if that matches the club equipment, that's certainly going to make life a lot easier. The start and finish marks. So sometimes it's a boat, sometimes it's an inflatable mark, sometimes it needs a flag on it, sometimes it doesn't. So just understanding what equipment's going to be needed for the start and finishing of the racing will be in there. The other bit that will be in the sailing instructions is a course configuration, quite often displays as a diagram. And that will let you see how many marks are involved and whether is it a trapezoid course, a triangular course, or a windward-leeward course, or any other sort of combination. So it lets you see the sort of shape of course that you're going to have to be laying on the day when racing starts. And once you start to see the course configuration, you can then start adding up the total number of marks. So if there's a trapezoid course, you're going to find that there's 4 main course marks, but then you might find that the leeward marks on a trapezoid course are gates, so there's an extra mark or 2 thrown in there, so suddenly you need 6 course marks, and then if the finish and the start is needing another 2 marks, then you're up to 8 marks. So you can start to see how it lets you start to plan. I need to get 8 marks, 8 sets of rope, 8 anchors and things like that. So it is worth a good kind of read through of the sailing instructions from a club and from a sort of mark layer perspective to make sure that you get all this kit together. The other little bit that just to be aware of is it'll also specify the number of courses, you know, so if it's a big event, I've worked at the UK Youth, for example, and they actually have 3 trapezoid courses, but there's only one wee sentence that tells you that in the sailing instructions, because the course configuration and the number of marks is all the same for each course, but suddenly that 8 marks that I thought I needed turned into 24 marks and 24 anchors and 24 bits of rope. So just make sure that you're picking up all the information out of the sailing instructions. How many courses are they needing as well? And that will allow you to start planning there, the bit at the bottom, so the total number of warps and anchors that you're going to need. You know, if it's 24 marks, that's quite a substantial amount of kit, or is it just one course, it's 8 marks, suddenly that's much more manageable. So all of that information can be got from the sailing instructions, and it's quite helpful from a mark laying perspective, is if you can be involved with the sailing instructions when the race officer is pulling them together, just to make sure that what they're putting in terms of description of marks matches up with what the equipment you've got available at your club. So that starts to sort of set the scene and give us an idea with what kit and equipment we're going to be needing to run the event. Okay, so the next little bit really is just on preparing the kit. So you can see various shapes and types of buoys that can be used there for setting up for an event. I think that was in Abu Dhabi. It might be that, there's a lot of kit involved. This was at UK Youth, so you can see, a lot of ribs, a lot of kit all has to then get sorted out and put on board boats. One of the things that's really useful when you're preparing all the equipment for an event is just trying to standardize the anchors, the chain and the warp lengths to suit the venue will help. So your Hebe Haven Yacht Club will have some equipment we'll have a wee look at shortly. But it is worth just trying to standardize it, and it's not for me to tell everybody or each club what they need, because it will be different for each club. There'll be different seabeds, so you might want to consider different types of anchors. There'll be different depths, so you'll need different clubs will need to think about different lengths of ropes and things like that. So it has to be a sort of in-house system that comes up. But the key components are there's going to need to be some sort of anchor. We certainly recommend that onto the anchor there's a length of chain. And onto the length of the chain, we're then going to attach a rope, and that's going to come up to the surface. And on the surface, we're going to attach some sort of buoy there. So that's the key components of the system. I think with this, it's not going to be like anchoring a yacht. If you do your old sort of yachtmaster qualifications, you let out 4 times the depth So that's not really practical for mark laying purposes. We're looking to, and that's really the benefit of the chain onto the anchor. So we're looking for sort of a good 3 or 4 meters or slightly more, a length of chain on the anchor just to hold the anchor onto the seabed, and so that the rope's pulling that weight of chain along the seabed. So a good few meters of chain is needed onto the anchor. The rope itself just needs to be the sort of depth of water plus the height of tide if it's going to come in where you are, plus if there's a big swell running a couple of meters to allow for that. And if you wanted to chuck in another meter or 2 length for luck, if you like, then that would help. But we don't want 4 times the depth in terms of a length of rope for mark laying, because we're not holding a boat with this equipment. We're just going to be holding a very light inflatable buoy with this anchoring system. Excuse me. So we're not looking for great big long lengths, but obviously it needs to be long enough to touch the bottom. Excuse me. We need to just think about how these components are all connected together. So a fairly standard way is, well, let's shackle the chain onto the anchor and put a cable tie through the anchor, because we never really want that to come undone. The anchor and chain would stay connected almost permanently together. When we come to connecting the rope to the chain, we might want to just think about that, because we might be using different lengths of rope for different areas that we're racing in. So we might want to change the rope. So having a permanent knot from the rope to the chain maybe isn't what we want if we're going to maybe be using shorter bits of rope or longer bits of rope, depending on where we're laying the mark. So we need to think about how that would then get connected up. And then at the other end of the rope, we're going to be attaching the rope onto an inflatable mark. So quite often these marks will have webbing straps and things coming from underneath them with a couple of stainless steel rings on them. Are we just going to tie it on? Is there going to be a carabiner type clip on the bottom of the mark that we can tie a bowline and clip the loop onto the mark? So we just need to have a wee think about how we connect up the components. And there is no right way. It's what's going to work for the club. But the important part of all this is that we have a system. So however one mark is set up and connected and joined together, all the marks are set up and joined and connected together in the same way. And that system then allows mark layers to become interchangeable. If you have to go and lift somebody else's mark, you're not finding a big fankle of rope. You know what to expect, and when you pull the buoy out of the water, it's exactly what you expected to see, so you can deal with it and sort the equipment out quickly without trying to unfankle somebody else's mess, if you like. The other little components that might come into play is just some of the terminology here that certainly we use over here is a cocking weight. So a weight on the bottom of the buoy that will hold the buoy upright. So some of these buoys, particularly that big tall cylinder there, they'll just tend to fall flat in the water unless there's some sort of weight to hold it vertical. And similarly, most buoys need some sort of weight underneath them just to help keep the buoy flat or upright in the water. So what sort of weight is that? And how do we connect that to the buoy as well? Is that onto a carabiner? Is that, and what is the weight? Is it a concrete weight? Do we use divers' lead weights and things like that? How much weight do we need? Some buoys need more weight than others. So thinking about some sort of weight just to hold the buoy upright. Sinker weights I've put in there under the rope. Sometimes if you're anchoring and putting a buoy in the water and you've got some spare rope because it's maybe shallower than you thought, then what do you do with that spare rope? Obviously, you maybe want it to sink. So you have a little weight that you can just tie onto the end of a piece of line and chuck it in the water, because you don't really have a lot of time to start coiling ropes and then securing the coils. So a little sinker weight just to put onto the end of the rope and chuck the whole lot in the water, making sure obviously it's attached to the buoy, will allow that spare rope to be sunk and just kept out of the way. And then what we might call an angel weight. So if it's a really windy event or there's a particularly big swell running and we're worried about our anchor maybe being bounced along the bottom, then we might want to add an additional weight just to where the chain joins the rope to help hold the chain on the seabed and things like that. So that's what we call an angel weight or an anchor weight. So different weights there that we might consider adding into the system to help us. obviously they are all weight, so at the end of the day we've got to pull all this stuff back up. So there's always a balance between trying to get away with the minimum to do the job, without making our job overly strenuous. If it's going to take you 20 minutes to pull a mark up because there's a ton weight on the end of it, then that's going to be quite a challenge. We might have to move marks quickly, but equally we don't want them dragging and things like that. So it's always a sort of bit of trial and error to come up what's going to work for what you've got. The advantages of standardizing this kit is there's no surprises. All the mark layers now can teamwork. They're all working in the same way. The roles become interchangeable. If I have to go and lift your mark and you're going to come and shift my gate, then we know what to expect. There's no surprises. We can swap around our places on the water and we become interchangeable. It can be quite helpful to have a spare set of ground tackle out on the water in one of the boats. And what we mean by ground tackle is that anchor, that chain and that warp. Because if you needed to reset a mark quickly, then if you've got a spare set, if you lose a set, it's going to come in handy. But equally, if you also have a small pickup buoy, it might be, if you've got a spare set of ground tackle, what you can do is, rather than lifting it, which takes time, is unclip the mark from the top of it and put a little cherry buoy just to keep hold of that line so you don't lose it. And then you can go and reset the mark with the spare set of ground tackle that you've got. And then when you've got time, you can go back later and recover the set that you put the cherry buoy onto. So there are some things just to sort of think around there. A couple of wee spares would just make life a wee bit easier. But the key thing is to have a standard system and everybody does the same thing. We don't all start doing our own things or start thinking we know better. We all work off the same system. And I guess just at the end of an event is, you know, the kit all tends to be sorted out for the start of the event, and really the easiest time to reset it is when the event finishes, is just put everything back the way that it was, the way that, and then the club and you know that you're ready to go next time. There's not a lot of time and effort put into planning and preparing for events, but the Markline kit, if it's put away tidy and sits in a box, then it's not going to change between the next time. Okay, so what's the system at the club that you've got there? What sort of anchors have you got at Hebe Haven? How much chain have you got? How's that connected to the anchor? The rope, what lengths of ropes have you got? How's it connected to the chain? And then how do we connect the rope to the buoy? Well, this is what we've got set up in the room. And I'm going to hand over to Dougie there in the room, and he's going to just talk a little bit around the pictures. This is the Hebe Haven Markline equipment that actually I'm quite impressed with. There's a lot of time and effort put into thinking about this and setting it up for the club. So I'm going to mute my button and hand over to Dougie.
So I guess up on the left-hand side is the basic small orange tall marks that we use for the offies. They do have a very small anchor on it and a little bit of weight to keep it upright. In the middle is also very basic cherry buoy that we use for maybe around trio, basic racing. And then the main set, we've got an 8 kilo Danforth plus quite heavy chain. That shouldn't go anywhere, even outside boat shelter when we've got 30 meters of water. Pretty confident that's not going anywhere. We've got sets of 25 meter warp, which is the one on the right, which is tagged with red heat shrink. Those ones we definitely know are 25 meters if they've got the tags. If they're not that, you need to check what it is. Make sure you're not trying to put 25 meters of line out in 30 meters of water, vice versa. And the other sets are 35 meters. The big cylindrical buoys need quite a bit of weight to keep them upright. So we also have a big set of chain, almost the same weight as on the bottom. Plus the webbing at the bottom, make sure that that's straight. If that's skewed at all, then your buoy will sit at an angle. If it's sitting at an angle, it's difficult for the dinghies to come in close to the mark, or if it's moving. Those big weights should hold it nicely. And it also, attached to the line, creates, we don't have the line coming away at an angle that a keel is going to catch, particularly for the keel boats for the racing here. it's going to go down and then it's going to be away. I think that's about it. And on the far left's a cherry buoy, which I think David talked about more in the next webinar, which we can use our rib to lift that, as it's quite heavy. We don't want to be pulling that out of the water. We can use the power boat and the cherry buoy to get that to the surface, and there's no lifting involved. Okay, David.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Dougie. And as I say, when I set this up, I was very impressed to find that the club there at Hebe Haven, they've obviously spent a lot of time just thinking about this and how it works for the different marks. We can see all the components there, the caulking weights. Do you have any additional angel weights, Dougie? So any weights that you would add on to maybe the chain on the seabed if it was a particularly windy event? Or
for the smaller stuff, I think there is. I think there's a weight on the yellow line on the Oppie one.
Right.
But that chain's about 10 kilos. It shouldn't be going anywhere.
Yeah, yeah. That's great, thanks. And I think, certainly where I am, we have different lengths of rope because we work with quite a different variety of depths. So what we do is exactly what you've done. We color code the end of the rope with a piece of sort of basically PVC tape. So we know that you mentioned the red tape there is a certain length, and we have a blue tape as another length, and a black tape as a third length, and all the ropes are pre-cut and then taped. So just by looking in a bucket of ropes, you can tell what length it is by the color tape marks that have been put onto it. So that's a great idea and good to see. I think just looking at the picture myself, I think that yellow rope, it looks to me like a floating line, as though it's a sort of heaving line. I'm not sure if that's the case. So sometimes with floating lines, that's where these lines sink, or just additional piece of weight on the line can just make sure that the line stays under the water, which you already mentioned. So that's good. So I think that's a really good example of some well thought out kit laid there at the club. And you can see how all the components are there and how it all works. And it's all pre-connected together, I guess, Dougie, or do you have to connect some of that together out on the water?
The top weights and the buoys are separate. The anchor, chain and warp should be one set.
Okay, so there is a bit of adding these caulking weights to hold the buoys upright underneath them once you've got the buoy in position. Yeah, good. Okay, thank you very much. So we'll move on. I think it's probably the last wee bit on the marks. I would say it's good practice to, particularly with these big race marks on the right there, is not to tow them behind the rib. Because it will put a lot of strain on, so if you've got 2 or 3 marks to lay, you can imagine how they're all sort of taking up a lot of space in the boat, but it is much better to have them tied into the boat, even if they're kind of sort of flowering out the back, but not towing them in the water. It will allow you to move faster in the rib to get to where you need to be, but it will remove all the strain just from the attachment points in the buoy, and the buoys will actually spin a wee bit as well in the water, and then the rope becomes all kinked up and the strops underneath them. So if you can, I would certainly recommend that when you're going out onto the race course with this kit, is try and find some way of just getting the buoys out of the clear of the water and in the rib as you move out. Okay, folks, there's a wee question break there. If anybody's got any questions, either via the chat or just wants to unmute and ask a question.
Yep.
Yep.
We do some we do some night racing, and having done that, we find it's quite difficult to actually see the marks, even though we've got lights on them. Do you have any special recommendations about where to put them, what lights to use, etc.?
To be honest, no. I haven't done any night racing. A lot of this comes from a sort of dinghy side of things. So obviously, they're not going to be out racing in the dark. I mean, if you have lights on them already, then it's maybe just looking at the type of lights that are not, certainly sort of modern LEDs are, much easier on batteries and visibility and brighter and things. I mean, the other thing is maybe reflective tape on the mark. So if you've got yachts coming in and looking for them, if they shone a torch on them, then it would reflect the light back to them. So it'll be much clearer. And I think just making sure that the GPS position, so those that have put the mark in have actually got its GPS position saved, and you're less likely to lose it. But the GPS position could also be given to those that are racing around it if it's not already. Yeah, I mean, that's just off the top of my head, a couple of suggestions. I don't have much experience of that. Does that help? Yep. Is there any other questions, or we'll move on? I'm not seeing everybody's face if you've got your hand up, so just unmute and chip in if you're online.
No, yeah, everyone's okay now.
Okay, so let's move on. So some of the tools of the trade that you're going to need as a mark layer. I mean, to be honest, what tends to happen, certainly over here in the UK, is that the club or the venue will provide all the equipment we've just been looking at. So the anchors and the buoys, that's not really personal kit. That's up to the club to provide that. But once we get into some of this sort of equipment, some of it's quite expensive. And the suggestion is not here that you rush out and buy everything, and we'll talk about what the minimum requirements are, but it's just to make you aware of some of the stuff that's available, and those that get into the sport of mark laying, if you like, will go and invest a wee bit of time and get some of this personal equipment from them. It's not something that's usually provided by the club. So let's have a wee look at some of that. This is a picture from one of the Olympic mark laying boats from 2012 in London. This is the Pimp Your Boat competition. With a whole range of sort of mark laying equipment there on the boats. Lots of duplication. There's more than one clock running. There's 2 GPSs there. There's depth gauges. There's more than 2 radios, paper, pencil. The reference point sheets that we talked about, and the last one, they can be seen around the top of the screen there, wedged into the window. So there's lots of different equipment that you need. A lot of it there is held on, as you can see, by kind of sort of gaffer tape or that sort of sticky Velcro, plastic Velcro that you can get to hold your equipment on in the rib. But let's maybe look at what some of that is. So an anemometer, something that's going to give you wind readings. It's pretty common practice for the race officer to say to one of the mark laying ribs, can you go upwind and start telling me what sort of wind readings you're getting, because he's trying to get a feel for how to set the race course up. So wind speed is useful information to be able to feed to the race officer. It might be that some classes have a minimum wind speed, so if it's not above 7 knots, we're not going racing. So suddenly the wind speed becomes quite critical as to whether the day is going to even happen or not. So being able to measure the wind will give you a feel for that. It can be quite hard to estimate, do you think the wind is 7 knots or not? That's a bit tricky. But if you've got an anemometer, then you've got a definitive answer. Handheld GPS we talked about, and we used that in the club last time. So pretty much you're going to need a GPS unit so you can help set the course up with bearings and distances between the marks. The other wee bit with the wind there is some sort of birdie or wind finder, because we're not only want to know the wind speed maybe, but more critical is going to be the wind direction. What direction is it coming from? Because the course is going to be orientated around the wind direction, so that it's likely that we'll be giving some wind readings in terms of the direction to the race officer to help decide the layout of the course. And with the birdie or the wind finder, there is also some sort of handheld a bearing compass. So not just saying it's from the north, you might want to know more specifically that it's only 352 degrees is what you're reading. So a compass, and then you line the compass up with your birdie to take a wind reading and provide that information back to the race officer. Down the more expensive end on the bottom left is a sort of laser range finder. These were designed for the golf course. And we talked in the last webinar that if you're setting up mark laying gates, the distances between the gate marks is quite small, and what we tend to find is a GPS error can be quite large, over 30 or 40 meters. So laser rangefinders are a very accurate way of measuring the distance between gates. So another piece of equipment. Handy to have with you on the water, a copy of the racing rules of sailing, because the flags and some of the signalling and information's in there, so it's a useful book to have. A timer, a stopwatch can be useful, so you can feed back as to how long the races are taking. So this is not just the countdown for the start of a race, which is what the sailor will tend to use this stopwatch for, but there'll be a target time for the race. And certainly some of the dinghy events are just looking for sort of 45 to 50-minute races, so you can time them on your legs and start to estimate if the race is going to be overtime or under time, and help feed that back to the race officer, so you're aware of how long things are taking. If your rib or your markline boat doesn't have a depth gauge, which is quite common, it's not normal for lots of small ribs to have depth gauges, so you can actually get a handheld depth gauge that really comes from the diving world. And you stick that into the water with your hand, just below the surface, and then it will give you a reading down to the seabed with the depth. So it does involve getting your hand wet, but it will allow you to see what the depth is, particularly if you're in an area where you're less sure or less familiar with. A small set of binoculars can be useful. It might be that, just from a safety point of view, for keeping an eye on boats on the water if there's capsizes, but it might be that you're also trying to be looking for sail numbers to report them back. So if somebody hits a mark and then you need to get their sail number, obviously we don't want to get too close to them from a rib, because they're still racing. Binoculars certainly help us keep an eye on the fleet. Some of the other equipment that's useful is there's what's called a weather writer there, which, if you can see it, really is it's an A4 clipboard with a sort of Perspex plastic screen that sits over it. So if you are having to sit and record mark roundings on a wet day, then you can get your hand under there to write the information down. And that all folds flat as well, and it'll fit into your kit bag, but allows you on wet days really to use A4 sheets of paper and write on them. So if you're recording mark roundings or whatever, you can still do that sitting at the mark. A voice recorder, sometimes useful just for similar things. If you're having to record mark roundings or sail numbers, then some way of recording that. The voice recorder would be the more fancy way. The old-fashioned way would be to use the other two bits there. So a pen and paper really, or pencil and paper, and write things down. There's listed there as wet notes, and these are quite useful wee books that the RYA produces over here, but really what it is waterproof paper. It's also pretty indestructible. You can't tear it, and it's completely waterproof. It doesn't work with a pen, but you can always get a pencil to write on it. So that's quite a useful way of recording things. Again, if you're out in sort of wet conditions, then these ability to write things down in wet with paper and pen is good. There's some on the right hand side there's some signalling horns. There's some different varieties. But having a horn so you can make some sound signals in your markline boat can be useful, particularly for having to change the course or signal to competitors. Most sailing events, they prefer the markline boats. The sailing instructions will tell you just need a sound signal. So that in theory could be a whistle, but what we've found in practice is it's preferable for marklayers to have horns, because quite often at certainly big dinghy events, the international jury will be going around in ribs and they use whistles. And that can get a bit confusing for competitors, whether you're signalling to them or whether you're telling them off. Usually the jury's kind of telling them off, so the whistle gets them a bit spooked. So just to differentiate, we would try and encourage you to use a horn rather than a whistle as a signalling system. Video camera is always useful. That's in there. And what we call a Charlie board, and we'll talk a wee bit more about that in the next webinar, but it's a board that signals to the competitors. So the middle of that Charlie board there has got international code flag C, which is for change of course. And what we're signaling in this example is there's a plus sign, so the length of the course has got bigger, and there's a starboard triangle there, so the length of the course is also the windward mark, if you like, has been shifted to the right. So it's been moved upwind and a little bit to the right. So we've moved the mark during racing, and we have equipment that we can signal that to the sailors. So that sort of Charlie board we would use. There are some standard forms that you need to think about. So whether it's mark rounding forms, or you have to go and finish the race course at a windward mark and the committee boat doesn't have time to move up, so you go and anchor your marking rib, then you need to record the finishing. So there are some forms that you can maybe use. Quite often they're held on the committee boat, so maybe you have to collect them from them to use. And then just being aware of what the different signal flags mean. We've just talked about the Charlie one there, but there are one or two others that can be used during racing as well. So just an understanding of them will help. You thought there was a lot of equipment. Remember, this is the Pimp Your Boat competition. Cable tie is always a useful spare to carry on a markline boat.
So
Question, David.
Yeah.
Could we just go back one slide, please?
Yeah.
I don't think you I may have missed it, but I don't think you mentioned the bottom right, the 3 yellow thing.
Ah, sorry. Yeah. So they're lifted. It's a different type of horn, if you like. It's basically a signaling device. So the one at the top, the red one, is a more traditional blow into the end. If you look at that yellow one there, you can see a little hole in it just in the middle. And what you do is you blow into that. They're actually very loud. They're quite effective little horns, but they're just a wee bit smaller than the big red one that you might fit an aerosol can to. So this is just a handheld blowing into it. So that's what these are. They're just other horns, if you like.
Thank you.
Batteries are going to be important because you're going to be running a GPS all day out there. So most of them work off AA's. So having a little supply of batteries is going to be helpful. Some sort of multi-tool, which will have a knife on it, but even pliers if you have to loosen off a shackle onto an anchor or something like that. So always useful to have, as is bits of tape, and always useful in the boat. VHF radio. Now it might be that the rib you're in for mark laying is fitted with a sort of a boat's fixed set, and that's fine. But sometimes just having a spare or even a handheld can be useful. When you're moving about your rib, because you're not necessarily at the steering console driving the boat when you're laying a mark. So if there's something on the radio, if you've got a handheld, you're paying out a line, you can still talk into a radio. And of course, a phone. Now, you don't need 5 phones. That's just a picture of different types of phones, but a mobile phone on board that you can communicate with is going to be quite key as well. First aid equipment would be handy. And the red and white tape, roll of tape there is what has come in at this country, as if for any reason as a mark layer you become a safety boat, and if there's a serious injury and you pick a casualty up and you're having to take them ashore, is we've developed a practice of then tying on to the dinghy that you're leaving behind some red and white tape, usually at the rudder. So if another safety boat comes along and they're going, where's the body? They say, actually, I can see this boat's been dealt with. Somebody else has got the casualty, because they've marked the boat, that they're not looking for the person that should be with that boat. So if you're taking anybody off a boat in a sort of emergency and abandoning the dinghy that they were sailing, we just mark that dinghy so the next rib that comes along doesn't start panicking. So that's why some of that red and white tape. That's maybe a more local procedure. Okay. There's a lot of kit there. It all adds up to an awful lot of money. So what I suggest you do is if you enjoy mark laying and you get into it, is you put something on the Christmas list and you build that up over a period of time as we go through. As a minimum to get started, you're going to need some sort of the wind reading direction. You're going to have to be able to write stuff down. You'll need your reference point sheets. And you'll need a VHF radio to communicate. So the VHF radio may already be on the boat. So if as a sort of personal equipment, your GPS, your hand bearing compass, your burgee, paper and pencil, and the reference point sheets will allow you to operate in the boat and set up a race course. Okay, so you've got all the equipment. You then need to make sure that your boat is ready to go. If it's your own boat, that's fine. Quite often, volunteers for an event or maybe driving somebody else's boat. So there's some practical issues like where are the keys, how do I find them, what do I do with them at the end of the day. So you need to go down to the boat, make sure you've got that. You need to make sure it's fueled up, that you understand, are we fueling up at the end of the day or are we fueling up in the morning before we go out? What's happening with fuel? Am I paying for it and claiming it back, or is there a fuel account set up for the event? So just making sure that you're fueled up, you're ready to go, you know what's happening. You've got all your mark laying kit on board, your marks, your buoys, your anchors, you've got it all secured in the boat. And then if you are working with somebody else, so who is your crew? Who are you working with that week? And you need to make sure that you've kind of found them. There's a lot of people maybe sort of hanging around the clubhouse at the start of a big event, be very busy, all trying to work out who's with who and what's going on. So try and find who you're going to be working with during the week. So really that means the mark laying kit is set up, your boat is set up, and you and your crew are set up at this stage. We're almost ready to go out in the water and start mark laying. Have we got any questions so far on some of what's been said? Okay, yeah.
David, as a mark layer, do you take any account of the weather, or do you leave that to the race officer?
Yeah, well, we're just moving on to look at what the wind and weather is really going to be doing. So, but yes, I mean, I guess at this stage, if there's very little wind and it's not sure if racing is going to happen, it's quite common for the race officer to send out one mark layer onto the race course while they sit in the clubhouse to keep the, so looking at the clubhouse, it doesn't look very windy. So they'll send somebody out just to be on the racecourse area. And so if the wind starts to fill in, they're feeding back wind, speed and direction. So they start to get a feel for when things might happen. So that's quite common. The other little bit with the weather is the other extreme. If it's really, really windy, it might be the race officer sends it. So you end up drawing straws to see which mark boat's going to go out in the howling wind and gale, just to actually get some wind readings in case it starts to drop. So you might sit out in some quite bad weather, because if you've got 100 competitors on the shore chapping at the bit to go, and some saying, why aren't we going yet, I can sail in that, then you've got the information to give them. So yeah, but we're going to move on and have a wee look at some of the wind and tide. So we're not quite ready to go in the water yet. There's going to be a race team briefing, and there's a mark layer you need to go along to this. And the race officer hopefully is going to run this team briefing. And the team briefing is more than just the mark layers. It's got everybody on the committee boat that's pulling the flags up and down, everybody that's on the finishing boat. There's going to be those that are just maybe doing safety boats. There might be a safety officer in charge of safety, or advising the race officer. So there'll be some spare safety boats, and then there'll be some mark laying ribs or boats as well. So we all get together at this team briefing. That'll clarify what time the race officer wants people to go afloat, and about punctuality for that. It will clarify what the role of each team member is within the team. A little bit about the procedures, how he wants to do things, his criteria for starting a race, so whether there's minimum wind speeds and things like that. He'll talk a bit about the course laying method. Does he want the course in early? Is he happy to leave the course setting till a little bit later? Things like, what happens if the rule observance, if you see somebody hitting one of your marks, does he want to know about it? Do you radio their sail number across? The safety officer, what's their role and where are they going to be during racing? The radio procedures. So quite often there's a bit of a conflict. The mark layers are trying to set the course up near a start time, and the race officer's wanting silence because he's going into a start sequence. So how do you work that? So that's up for the race officer to clarify their procedures for using the radio. You also need to know where you're going to get your lunch, just your refreshments and things like that if you're going to be out in the water for the day. And then is there a daily briefing? So does this race team get together at 9 o'clock every morning before racing? And actually, are we going to get together at the end of the day's racing for a debrief? So is it a daily occurrence, or is it a start of the event and we'll have a debrief at the end of the event? Most big events, it would be common to have a daily briefing and a daily debrief. So it's worth just being aware of where and when these are going to be. So that's the race team. There's going to be quite a lot of people involved in the race team meeting. This is just another sort of photograph to give you the number of people involved. This was the laser race team at the London Olympics. Team there, so the safety boats, the mark layers, the finishers, the assistant race officers, and all the people on the committee boats. It is important that as at least one of the mark layers has a kind of one-to-one and cuts through all these people with the race officer. We just need to discuss the plan of, I've got 3 ribs to set 8 marks. This is what I'm planning on doing so that they can understand that. Just the time needed if the race officer is thinking of changing the course. My experience is it's quite often a last-minute decision, and sometimes lastminute.com doesn't work. You don't have time to pull all these ropes and anchors up. So it's worth just discussing these kind of options with the race officer and just trying to discover how they like to work. So for example, I've had conversations with the race officer, like, see if we're thinking of changing the course, can we just have a conversation on the phone rather than on the open VHF radio, so we can start to get a heads up with what you're thinking, and then we can start planning how we can move it as quickly as possible. And that might mean moving some of the mark resources around the course area. So just trying to get a feel for that. It can be quite useful just to introduce the person that's going to be laying the start line. So that's the mark that's going to be closest to the committee boat, because it's quite common for the race officer to be constantly changing or just tweaking the start line to try and have a nice square line for the sailors. So just the fact that the race officer can put a face to a name on the end of the radio, if you like, can be quite helpful. And how does he want to set the line? Is he going to be given sort of visual streaming instructions, and we'll talk about that later, or is he going to be talking over the radio to the person? And we just need to confirm the course distances and angles. So we talked in the last webinar for the trapezoid courses, there's 60-degree sheets and there's 70, so there's different angles of courses. What are we actually using for this event, and a rough idea of the distances. Now the distances will change a little bit depending on the wind strength, but if we get a feel for what he's thinking, that helps. And then just agreeing the communication. So the VHF, is the safety boats going to be on the same channel as the race management? So, or is there 2 channels we're going to be using, one for safety and one for race management? And just checking that you've got each other's phone numbers and things like that. I'll quite often just put the race officer in as a sort of speed dial, so I don't have to keep looking them up in my phone book. So just sort of setting that up and checking we can communicate. So this one-to-one with the race officer between the Mark 9 team is quite a useful conversation just after their briefing. Okay, now we're ready to move out onto the water. We're looking at setting up a trapezoid course. I know that at Hebe Haven, a lot of time you're not doing a trapezoid course. What I would do is if you think of a trapezoid course, all it is 2 windward-leeward courses that share the same start line and the same finish. And it allows 2 races to be happening at the same time. So between marks 1 and 4 there is what we would call the inner loop. You can have fleets of racing doing a windward-leeward course, and between marks 2 and 3, you've got a different fleet of boats doing a windward-leeward course, but they would both start and finish at the same place. So it's just a 2 racetrack course, for example. So don't get overly confused by the trapezoid configuration. It's 2 windward-leeward courses, and I think you there at Hebe use windward-leeward courses quite a lot. So you could just drop off the outer loop, and we'll come on to that. But the reason for putting the trapezoid course in from a mark laying point of view is if mark layers can set this course up, that's as hard as it gets. Windward-leewards on their own become much easier. So we tend to sort of work with the hardest, and then anything afterwards is going to be a little bit easier. So we're going afloat. Quite often the mark layers and the race management team would like to go afloat to the race area before the sailors. So the sailors might not even be launched. The safety boats might not be on the water, but the race officer would like to get somebody out onto the racetrack area so we can start going out. And the mark layers are often there first. The committee boat is obviously a yacht or a bigger, heavier boat. It's going to take longer to transit out of the marina or the berth. But the ribs can shoot out quite quickly. So usually the first person on scene, if you like, on the race area is going to be a mark layer. And they can start to gather information for the race officer who's maybe on his way out. Any questions just on the sort of team briefing side of things? No? Okay, we'll move on. Okay, so we now move on to just sort of wind and tide, and that's what we call is the axis. So even a windward-leeward course, technically, we would set it up on the axis and not set it up in the wind. So wind and tide gives us the axis, and it's the axis that we need for those that did the previous webinar. That then tells us at what line in the tables we're going to be going into to set the marks. So the axis needs to be confirmed before the course can be set. It's more than just the wind direction. It allows for different winds over the whole course area, and it's quite common for different wind readings to come in from different ribs spread out over the course area. So it's an average of the wind, if you like, but it also allows for the tide. And it's worth monitoring the wind over a period of time over the whole course to get a feel for what it's doing. We're going to end up with one number, one bearing for the axis, but just monitoring it over a period of time helps us build up a picture of what's happening. So the sooner we can start doing our wind readings when we get out onto the race area, the better. Time spent on agreeing this access is time well spent, because at the end of the day, we're going to put a whole lot of marks and anchors into the water. And if we've got the axis wrong, all we'll be doing is pulling them back up. So we're creating more work for ourselves. So getting it right first time is better. So it's time spent monitoring the wind and getting a feel for it. Because once we know the axis, we can then use these reference point sheets that we looked at to set the course up. So doing these wind and tide readings is time well spent. So first of all, the wind, sometimes called the ground or the gradient wind, some information there. So really that's measured from a fixed point. So an anchored committee boat would be a fixed point. Generally, you'll find if you're on a committee boat, the wind instruments are at the masthead, so that the wind speed will always tend to read slightly higher because it's higher up, okay? Whereas if you're on a If you're lower down, the wind speed is slightly less. And if you're in a drifting rib, which is what we are going to be as mark layers, then we're going to be, if we're drifting, you know, downwind at 1 knot, then our wind speed is going to be 1 knot less than what we'd be reading as if we were fixed. So the wind speeds tend to be slightly less from the ribs than they are from the committee boat. But if we understand that, we don't need to worry about that. What we talk about is wind sniffing. It's quite common for these mark layers to sort of spread out over the race course area, even though the course isn't down, just spread themselves out to roughly where they think they're going to be, and just sitting there, as you can see in the picture, holding up our burgee, holding up the hand-bearing compass, and just feeding that information back to the committee boat. If you are going to be taking wind readings from a rib, just make sure that your rib's stopped. You know, so if you've been zooming along and the race officer calls you for a wind reading, make sure the boat's actually stopped. Otherwise, you'll be getting an apparent wind effect. So make sure the boat's stopped. That means a wee bit of reverse just to take any momentum off, any way off. That'll help, that you're stopped and just drifting, and then you can measure the wind. And if everybody's spread out over the race course, 2 or 3 mark laying boats, then it's quite common just every 5 minutes they just do a round of calls over the VHF radio, just of what speed and what direction they're getting, and that all helps build up that picture. There are some wind tracking sheets that you can use, so you could write all these bearings and speeds down, and that helps you just to build up a picture over time. And quite often that's what's actually happening on the signal boat, on the committee boat, the race officer, all the information that's coming in, it's all written down, and then they can build a picture. Is the wind veering to the left or the right? Is it oscillating every 10 minutes? Does it keep going left, then back to the right? You know, and build up a picture of what's happening. So the tide, slightly different things. This is a picture here we can see of what we call a tide stick, but actually it doesn't have to be a stick. You could just throw into the water anything that's going to float, but as long as it's not too buoyant, so a stick or a sponge that will sit in the water, or even a bottle of water, but just make sure it doesn't sink, so just take a little bit of air on the top, but as long as it's kind of going to be mostly sitting in the water, not getting blown by the wind. And then what we do is we can measure the distance that it moves in meters in a minute. So we could do that by eye, we could do it by a rangefinder, or we could do it by GPS. And then we get a formula there just to help us work out the speed in knots. So the speed in knots is the distance in meters that it moves in a minute, divided by 30 there. If you can put your tide stick or your little marker in the water to gauge the tide in next to a fixed object, so whether it's a fisherman's pot or a channel marker or anything that's actually fixed, even the committee boat, if it's anchored, you know, drop it in beside that, then you can just do it by eye. How far has it moved away from that fixed point in a minute? Or you could use a rangefinder to measure the distance in a minute. But that will then give you the tidal rate in knots using that simple calculation. Okay, why do we need to know what the tide is? So there's a little bit of sort of wind tide theory comes in here. So if we pick a day when there is no wind, sometimes called the ground gradient, when there is no wind, it's a still sunny day, but the tide is running. Okay, so if you were to sit there in a boat with no wind and the tide is running, then the boat's going to move. Okay, it's a bit like cycling your bicycle on a day when there's no wind. As soon as you push off and start to cycle, you feel a wind, that you create an apparent wind. So if there is no wind, the tide itself can create a wind because it will move you in the same way that cycling can do. So that, if we then introduce a little bit of ground wind, so that's the black line here, so we have the wind blowing down the board, but we then have that tide pushing us to the right, we then get this sort of vectors. There's a little bit of wind created by the tide, but predominantly the bigger one is the ground wind, and the resultant is that what we might call the sailing wind, which is skewed a little bit to the right there because the tide is running. So the tide might actually affect the wind that the sailors are going to feel as they race off upwind. So it's the wind experienced by a free-floating boat. So the compensation is, and really this is just what, so I'll put it all up. So the wind W1 there at the right is if there was no tide, that would just be the windward mark, straight up wind. There's 12 knots of wind blowing down the screen here. But if we've got a knot of tide running from left to right across the screen and we're getting that apparent tide wind, then that would set the windward mark down tide by 15 degrees into that sailing wind. So they've actually got a true beat up to the windward mark. Yeah. There's a bit of guesstimation, really. It's not an exact science, but really if the wind's a wee bit lighter, then the effect of the tide is going to be a little bit bigger. So we might want to set it the offset more than 20 degrees, down tide. Similarly, if the wind was much stronger, then the effect of that tide wind becomes less. Yeah, that's for the tide going straight across the screen. If it's diagonal, you're going to have half that allowance. So, and if it's 2 knots of tide rather than 1 knot, then you have to double the allowance. It's a little bit sciencey. I guess what we're trying to make the point here is that sometimes the tide will affect where the windward mark goes. So it's not just what is the wind direction, it's what's the tide doing to it as well. So we try and get a sailor's wind, if you like. There's a similar factor on a sort of leeward leg. So the adjustment of running the leg to the tide is critical for a good race. So really the rule of thumb that we work for is no matter what the wind strength, if there's a leeward mark, set the leeward mark down tide of the ground wind for every mark of cross tide. So the tide is affecting the racing here. There's tidal compensation there, and there you can see a windward-leeward course, and this is quite common to what happens there at Hebe Haven. As you can see, so we've got 12 knots of wind blowing down, straight down the screen, but we've set mark 1, the windward mark, has been offset because of the tide. So that's sailor's wind, that apparent wind, to allow for that. And then we've put in mark 2 there, an offset mark, so that they've also got a good running leg to come back down. So there's reasons for an offset mark. Some of it might be just so that yachts with spinnakers go rounding the windward mark don't turn around and just come straight into the boats that are racing up to the windward mark. An offset mark can be useful just to sort of a tidal correction, if you like, for the leeward leg. So all of that is really just going to say, that while you're sitting in your rib giving wind readings, if the axis that is agreed by the race officer is slightly different, it might be because there's good reasons for that. There's tide running, there's different wind readings coming in from different parts of the course. Okay, so it might be that the race officer is asking for some tidal information to help them find what the axis is doing. It might be that you work together with the race officer to try and agree the best axis, or it might be the race officer just tells you what the axis is. Good race officers will tend to work with you, and it's a collective agreement between the mark laying team and the race officers to what we think the best axis is to set up on. But ultimately, if they just tell you, you just do it. But really, just understanding some of this wind and tide theory might explain why the axis is not the same as the wind readings that you've been radioing into the committee boat. And it's all about making the racing fair for the sailors. As we said earlier, time spent agreeing this axis is time well spent out on the water. Okay, any little break there? Any questions so far on that? That technical wind bit? No? Okay, I'm thinking not, so we'll move on. So we're looking at the trapezoid course configuration. So we're going to race from the start. The inner loop there, the windward leeward on the right hand side, called the inner loop between mark 1 and 4, and the windward leeward and the outside loop, as we call it, over at mark 2 and 3. So that's the course configuration. And once we've got that wind direction, then or that axis, the combination of wind and tide, then we can start looking at the axis which we're going to set the course up on, which will be the sort of reciprocal of that. So once we've agreed the axis, we can then start using our reference point, because all the main marks of the course are based around the reference point once we know the axis, and we can read the numbers off the sheet. The sheet we're talking about is we looked at in the last workshop, so we're not going to spend too much time going back into how we do that. But the reference point is what we're going to set up. So I'll just jump back. Is that gate 4 or mark 4 in there? Is what we're going to be setting up the course on. If it was the committee boat, that could equally work if you didn't have an outer loop. If it was just a straightforward single windward and leeward, then the reference point could almost be the committee boat as well. So we're working on the axis, but we can actually get the reference point before we agree what the axis is going to be. And the earlier we can get the reference point, then the better. So we can get that reference point while we're still waiting to work out what the combination of wind and tide is. As we said in the last workshop, it's common for the mark layer who's setting the mark 4 to try and get and share the reference point around the rest of the mark laying team. We don't need the axis to get the reference point. We can get the reference point before we set the axis. And as we said last time, the mark laying teams have sort of developed radio procedures as to how you transmit and receive the reference point. So it's going to be a latitude and longitude. It's going to be sort of 16 numbers that are going to need to be effectively written down because you're not going to remember them. So a warning call on the radio saying I'm about to transmit the axis, and then a message from all the other mark layers saying they're ready to receive the axis. Then we transmit the reference point, and then the mark layers can maybe read it back to us. It's important that we've all got the same reference point set up in our GPS units. Even before we've confirmed what the axis is, we can get that work done early. Okay. Sorry, I think the screen just froze there, so we just... You can tend to get a feel for the axis before the course is set because you're out there reading the wind, so you can start to begin to think about what the axis is. And once you have the reference point, you can begin to moving the boat into the position where you think you're going to be laying the mark. Okay, and then that means that once the axis is actually agreed and we know which line we're going to be working off on our sheet for the bearing and distance to the reference point, even if it's changed at the last minute, we're not going to have to move very far because we're going to be pretty close to where it needs to be. So we're not having to zoom, 0.8 of a mile upwind to find the right position. We're already the right distance out and we're just waiting for final confirmation as to whether it's, 250 degrees or 255 degrees. But if we're only 5 degrees out, we're going to be pretty close to where we need to be and we can make final adjustments at the end. And then once the axis is finally agreed, the main course marks can then very quickly and simultaneously be dropped in by the mark layers who are all kind of hovering in position, just waiting for that confirmation of the final axis. Okay, it's quite common for the axis to be the last thing agreed by the race officer. So everybody, all the mark layers will be hovering in position, just waiting for that. Right, I can now confirm the axis, and once that's confirmed, we're pretty close to being in the right place, and all the marks are just dropped in the right position. And obviously, some of the marks will take a wee bit longer to set up, like the second gate marks and things like that. But the main course marks can be put in quite quickly once the axis has been agreed. A little reminder there, so that was the sheets that we looked at last time. This was for the 70-degree trapezoid. So the axis are the bearings in black there, you can see at the top. So all the way from 0 to 360 degrees round the compass. It's really two sides to that sheet, the left and the right. But whatever the axis, the number in black's agreed. So if we look just at the very top of the left one there, so if the axis is agreed as being north, 0, 0, 0, you can see we've then got all the bearings and distances for the different marks based on that axis. So we can then use these sheets to set the trapezoid course up, and we looked at these sheets last time. Any questions on that, folks?
Any chance repeat last time the chart? The last 2 pages?
Yeah, so I think I did quickly skirt over this because we spent a wee bit of time for those who were at the previous webinar, and I'm not sure if that was yourself or not, going through these sheets. So these are laminated sheets that the mark layers need to take out in the water, and they provide bearing and distances to the reference point from the different marks on the course. And the mark layers are using their GPS to get the bearing and distance correct for the mark that they are going to be setting. So there's different bearing distances for every sort of 5 degrees, round the 360 degrees of the compass. So it is a complicated, if you haven't seen it before, it is a complicated set of numbers that we had a look at in the previous sort of webinar. Yeah, there's probably a bit out with at the moment to go through it in too much detail, but if there is questions like that, so Dougie is there in the club for those that are at the club, and he could go through that with you at the end at the front if that would help.
Yes, I think it would be excellent.
Yeah. Sorry, was there any other questions on that wind and tide, the sort of the axis and agreeing what the axis was? Okay, moving on, I think we're almost there. Yeah, so that brings us really to the end of this webinar. Where we've been building up to is just in the first webinar was just looking at the practical skills that we need as a mark layer to be able to use a GPS unit. This time we've looked at getting the equipment ready, going along to the meeting with the race officer and finding out how he likes to work, and moving out onto the water and starting to take some wind readings, perhaps some tide readings, so we can agree what the axis is going to be for setting up the course. We haven't actually set up a course yet. So the next webinar really looks at the practical aspects of setting the marks in the water. So once we've found the right position, we've agreed the axis, how do we actually anchor the marks? How do we get them to stay in the right place? There's two different setting methods that we'll look at, and then we'll look at setting some specific marks and some options that we've developed around, you know, for example, gates and start lines and things like that. And we're also now, once the course is set, the race can begin, and if there's any signalling we need to do to competitors during the racing. So that's going to be the next webinar. Okay, which then really bring, and that's next week, and that brings us to a sort of finish of this current webinar.
Okay, David, I think that this has been the most amazing webinar. It's been very practical, and I think race officers and all people on the course have learned quite a lot tonight. I'd like to also say that we've got a lot of equipment laid out that Dougie and I have brought along, the sort of things that need to be taken out on the rib when you do mark laying. And we can also go down to the garden bar here where all the anchors are laid out for any questions from the floor. So I want to thank you very, very much indeed for an excellent talk.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, I want to thank Dougie for all the work that he's done too.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yes.
Okay, yes, no, thank you, Leslie. And I mean, I'm really about to sign off now. I think there is a show and tell opportunity with Dougie for those there in the clubhouse. If anybody's got any final questions, otherwise we can call it a night there, and hopefully you'll be able to join us next week.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Regarding the calculation formula of the currents of the tide, is a distance in meter in 1 minute divided by 30. The factor 30, what is that?
It's just the number you need to divide it by. So if you divide it by 30, it will then give you the speed in knots. So there's obviously all sorts of different units being used here, meters and seconds, and then nautical miles per hour.
Oh,
so
okay.
Most people are used to getting the tide, and you know, it's 1 knot or it's 2 knots rather than it's 12 meters per second. So it's because of the different units, but it's been kind of worked out that if you just work with that, so the distance in meters in 60 seconds divided by 30 will equate to an answer in knots, if that makes sense.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Yeah.
No more question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I would like to ask for any more questions from the members on the Zoom webinar.
No. Okay, well, we'll look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much, folks.
Yeah,
Thank you.
1 week
Thank you,
time.
David.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Very good. All right.